Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and today, for a little check-in on the world of homiletics, I'm going to talk about getting feedback from sermons, that really awkward moment where somebody comes up to you and they want to talk to you about the message. You can never quite tell. Well, I guess I should say you can never quite tell. You might be able to kind of guess based off of the person, especially if it's someone that you've had a connection with for a while. You might be able to take a guess where this is headed. But in over 10 years of Pulpit Supply ministry, I would say more often than not, if I'm standing in the back shaking hands after a message, 9 times out of 10, the comment that you are going to get after you get done preaching is, "Nice message today, preacher. Nice sermon today, young man." Whatever the case may be, enjoyed your message today, pastor. Like, it more often than not, the feedback is just a pleasantry. If people are going to say anything to you about your sermon, more than likely it is going to be just a pleasantry. Hey, thanks for showing up and doing that thing, is basically what they're saying. Thank you for, taking the time to be here this morning. And it's like at one point in time, and maybe just to show a little bit of growth, at one point in time, I really did not like the standing in the back, shaking everybody's hand part of the Sunday morning experience. I think there is a little bit still. I found it to be extremely awkward. I just find it to be really like Jim Gaffigan's got a joke about when you go to a wedding and it's the receiving line, I think it's what it's called, and you walk through and you shake hands with the bride and the groom and like literally everybody involved, and he's like, I feel like when you go to see a friend at like a low production musical and now you have to pretend like you were interested and that you had insight to give everybody. Like, I do think it's a little bit awkward, and honestly, when I can, I don't go stand back there because it does feel a little bit like, okay, now everybody come talk to me. I'm the most interesting person here. And I would rather, especially as somebody who's like more frequently a guest preacher, I would prefer just to kind of like be out of the way. You all do your fellowship thing. And if anybody wants to come talk to me, you can make your way to me if you want. Like, I don't feel the need to like put myself in a position where everybody who was there now has to talk to me. Granted, some of the churches I preach at, that's going to happen either way because there's so few people. But, some of the bigger churches, like, I don't really feel the need to have to like stand there and everybody has to come talk to me now. Like, you don't have to do that. But as I said, more often than not, 9 times out of 10, if someone's going to say something to you while you're back there, it's just going to be some nice pleasantry. Now, unfortunately, if it's not going to be a pleasantry, more than likely it's going to be a critique or a disappointing positive comment. I'll start with disappointing positive comment because that sounds like a weird thing. I have had a number of times where somebody has wanted to say something positive to me after the message, and usually it's whatever kooky illustration I used that they're like, oh, that was really funny, that was a great joke. Or I remember vividly, for some reason, one time I preached at a church, and for some reason I referenced in an illustration how on Sunday mornings as a kid I used to wake up and watch Bozo Circus on WGN. Like, that was like a whole thing. I forgot the greater context of the illustration, and more importantly, how in the world that fit into whatever I was preaching on that morning. And somebody like immediately pulled me aside after the service to talk about how much they also loved Bozo the Clown. So like, by the way, if you don't know who Bozo the Clown is, get cultured, Google him. He was an icon out here in Chicago and in other markets around the country. Anyway, so I have had a number of occasions where people want to like talk about a goofy illustration I had and how much they appreciated it, or sometimes they do talk about like how they related to it, you know, like they've had a similar experience or how it did help them understand a point before. Like that does come up every once in a while, but there's been plenty of times where somebody is so excited to talk about not the sermon and how it made an impact on them, but more specifically, whatever weird Lord of the Rings reference I shoehorned into the sermon that morning. But if it's not a pleasantry or a oddly specific illustration that you use that somebody really enjoyed, somebody is just going to come up to you and critique you. And here's the thing about the number of I would say all, if not all of the critiques I have gotten after a sermon, they were wrong. More often than not, whatever they wanted to come complain to me about was more so a stylistic thing rather than someone coming up to me to like call me out for heresy. Like if anyone is going to complain after a sermon about something I said, usually it's just that they didn't like how I presented something. There are some exceptions. I was once chewed out is not the right word. I was once corrected sternly after a service. I was preaching on Micah 6:8. This was actually at a youth group I was teaching at, and I was teaching out of Micah 6:8, and I talked about like the issues of racism and other things going on in the United States. By the way, it's 2019 at this point in time, and admittedly, the word social or the phrase social justice was still, even to me, a bit of like a boogeyman thing. I was still learning and growing. As you can imagine, it wouldn't be too much longer when we got to the year 2020 where all of that started to change for me. But still, like, even within the white evangelicalism that I was still sitting comfortably in, I could still look at the United States and say, wow, there's a bunch of racists still around here. We should probably do something about that, church. And somebody from the youth group, not a student, but a volunteer, did come up to me and corrected me about how it's just the media lying to me and making a big deal out of nothing. And Saudi Arabia has an even worse human record, like how they treat people. And like, here's the thing, very specifically when it comes to this topic of social justice, if you talked about it at a church and somebody comes up to you afterwards to correct you and they point out the fact that Saudi Arabia has an even worse record when it comes to how they treat other human beings, that just means they don't have a real argument. Because, yeah, Saudi Arabia is real bad with how they treat other people. That is just an argument tactic that the other people use to distract from actual issues going on in our country. That's all for free. Doesn't really have anything to do with, taking criticisms from people after your sermon. But just so you know, if somebody brings up how Saudi Arabia treats their people and other people as well, that's just them trying to distract themselves from actual issues going on in the United States. Anyway, another time I was talking about the Psalms and the different genres of the Psalms, and I mentioned, how genres are kind of this like complicated thing. Like sometimes, you think of like modern music examples of genre, like you could say, I like rock music, and that can mean anything from Elvis to Metallica and everything in between. Or you could say something like, I like punk rock. And now we've narrowed things down at least a little bit. And I was pulled aside afterwards by some very interesting people who really, they launched into the whole rock music is of the devil, and how the drumming in rock music allows for the devil to like disrupt us, and for demons to like get into you. And funny story about all of that is that although we've really lost the thread on where all of those kinds of thoughts and teachings came from, it turns out this is one of those things that like certain groups within Christianity just kind of like regurgitates over and over again. And yeah, there are certain forms of rock music that I do not particularly partake in. One part because I don't like the style, and another part because I think the messaging is a bit dark. But when somebody comes to you with the argument of, hey, the way that they do the rock shows and like the drumming and all that, especially if they bring up the drumming, that when you trace it really far back, though nobody ever does this anymore, that's actually rooted in a racist thought when it comes to like how drumming was done in like Africa among natives in their like tribes and whatnot. Like that's where that theology comes from. I'm sorry, let me say that again. That's where that quote, and I'm using all the quotation marks, theology comes from. It's racist. It's not rooted in anything remotely out of scripture or other. It's not. If you ever hear the argument that rock music is bad because Satan can use the drumming and the meter and all of this, any of those kinds of arguments about how the music disrupts you and all of this kind of stuff, though nobody actually says these things anymore, it's actually because we just have regurgitated it so much, it actually is traced all the way back to like these very racist things that Christians used to say. So yeah, isn't it interesting how many of these things, these complaints are actually just people being racist? Weird. So the interesting thing about these complaints, though, is that in the moment, when somebody is complaining to you, or at least in these moments where somebody has complained to me, one, I didn't have these answers at my disposal. These are actually things that, people bring complaints, and the best thing I can think to say is, well, that's very interesting. I will look into that further. Thank you for sharing that with me. And what's interesting is that when you look into it further, apparently it's racist that somebody would say such a thing, such a critique to you. Well, I guess it's not racist that someone said it to me, as much as that the thoughts are rooted in some kind of racial bias. Funny how that works out all the time, isn't it? So this is one of those moments where, and this is hard, and I hated it early on in my preaching ministry, and it's still not my favorite thing in the world, but I have never had a situation where somebody brings a complaint to me after a service and I feel the need to have to defend myself or what I said, but instead I just take it on the chin. If I knew better, then when these complaints were initially brought to me, I think, especially with those two examples, well, actually, no. When it comes to that music thing, one part is knowing the person who brought this complaint to me, there was no persuading going on. But although it does have this like racist roots in this argument against rock music, honestly, like, that kind of thinking is so small within Christianity anymore that I feel like this is just going to be something that just kind of like dies out on its own. Maybe that's wrong of me to think about it that way. When it comes to the person who was like, you're wrong about the racist issues in our country. That's just the media lying to you. Honestly, I think if I would have known better at the time, I would have stood my ground a bit more on that one. Especially, I will say, when they brought up Saudi Arabia, again, even in 2019, before I was like deconstructing my white evangelicalism hard, like even then in 2019, I was like, don't bring Saudi Arabia into this argument, like, because this is a weird flex. I'm a pro wrestling fan, and though it was a long time ago now, in 2019, the whole WWE signing an agreement with Saudi Arabia to do multiple shows, including one right after they murdered that New York Times reporter, like, yeah, I'm oddly familiar with the issues in Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much. It was almost a don't quote the deep magic to me moment, because at the same time, it's like, yeah, that's their issues and they're bad issues, but that doesn't mean we get to not pay attention to our own issues. Dork. It was another instance, though, where the person in question, this was somebody, again, that I knew. I don't know if arguing with the person over this, like I said, I did stand my ground a little bit on the Saudi Arabia part. I don't know if arguing with them over this really would have done any good, especially because by 2020, when I started seeing their posts online, nothing really changed. If anything, they were one of the people who got a little bit worse after 2020. But maybe that's wrong of me to think like, oh, well, they're not getting any better, so I should just wipe my hands clean of this situation. I don't know. But in the rarest of circumstances, if you're not just awkwardly standing there listening to people say, thanks for showing up today, and wondering why you're standing back there, or if people are just throwing verbal left and rights at you until you crumble internally, very rarely somebody will come up to you to say something positive about your message that is also like helpful towards you. Okay? Because sometimes you'll get this positive comment and it's really just more so like hey, that really spoke to me today, or, God wanted me to hear that message, or, this is something I have also been thinking about this recently, so thanks for, sharing about it. Like, every once in a while, yeah, you might get those kind of like light comments, but the like, oh my word, this has made a tremendous impact on my soul kind of comments, not very often. Truly, like, not very often. If anything, like I said, you're just going to get the pleasantries. And this is something that I think young preachers really need to tune in and listen to. That is the order that people are going to say things to you. It's going to be a pleasantry, or maybe, hey, I really like that story you told, or hey, stop saying we're racist. We're not racist, even though we are, but don't pay attention to that. Look at Saudi Arabia instead. And then, like, once a blue moon, you'll get a truly like impactful message, an impactful story from somebody in the congregation. And so if you're new to this and you're waiting for those stories, or you thought that they were going to be like super common, yeah, unfortunately, I'm here to tell you, you should stop holding your breath. That being said, when those stories come, boy, does it make an impact on yourself. It is so encouraging when those kinds of testimonies, it's not even like an impactful story. When a testimony of how a message really impacted a person, those are so appreciative. Yeah, thank you for telling me, thanks for showing up. And I'm really glad you liked that story. It's one of my favorite stories to tell people, so I'm glad you enjoyed it. But man, when you actually get one of those, like, hey, this is how this has made an amazing impact on my life, that's super helpful. And it sometimes shows up in the weirdest ways. One time I was teaching at a youth group, and I had the "let's talk about dating" message, and somebody like kind of after the message kind of realized that the relationship that they were in wasn't like moving them closer to Jesus, didn't really see a future with the person. They actually broke up with the person that they were dating after like not like immediately after my message. Boy, would that have been wacky. Like some person stands up and like in front of everybody, we're done. God told me we're done. But that has happened for me before. The reason why we're doing this episode is because I had a very interesting conversation with somebody. I've been preaching pretty regularly at a specific church over the past, it's probably like 2 years now, honestly. We've made a connection with a lot of people there. One of the teens there I've appreciated talking to them. They, are very reflective, and they don't have a youth group at this church. So I think, kind of serving in both lanes with this congregation. And, this teen in particular is very reflective and just wants to sometimes they have something that's like, oh, I really needed to hear that message. And then other times they're like, hey, you said this, here's how this, I talked about one time, I preached there one time on thankfulness and how it is rare that you ever hear about a Christian who is known for their thankfulness. You hear about people who are known for their love, their grace, their anger. Shouldn't be known for that one though. But you never hear about a Christian who is known for their thankfulness. And if you're wondering what the context of that is, stick around. That's coming up next week. And I had a great conversation with this person afterwards, and with this teen who was like, hey, I actually knew someone who was known, I would say, would have been known for their thankfulness, because whenever you ask them how they're doing, their response was, I'm thankful. And they would tell you what they're thankful about that day, and then would kind of go into normal conversation kind of thing. And so those comments, that's a really positive, I appreciate that kind of feedback, that kind of those kind of testimonies afterwards. But I had someone recently, and this is where we get to the past 20 minutes of our lives here together. I had somebody come up to me to talk about why they enjoy my preaching, which is always a weird one. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm everybody's cup of tea. Clearly not. I know that for a fact. But there is this person came up to me afterwards of a message, just something I was preaching out of the book of Acts that day. And they said that it feels like they're actually being fed when I'm preaching. I was like, that's good to hear. That should be the goal. That should be what we're hoping will happen anytime that somebody is listening to their sermon, that they're being fed and not just wasting 10 to 45 minutes or longer of their life just listening to some person ramble for a while. Kind of like when you listen to My Seminary Life. That's a joke. I need to start speaking more positively about myself and the things that I do. Thank you for listening to the show. I know this is making some kind of impact on somebody. But the reason why this individual said that they felt like they were being fed when they listened to the messages is because I am willing, especially now more than ever, because this happened within the past few months. Now more than ever, I am willing to sit down and say, and this is how the American church is failing you. And this is how the American church has failed me. This is how the American church has continued to fail the people that they are serving. And she said there was something about that when I talk about these issues, she said, it feels like it's actually the truth. And I stopped her for a moment. I was like, it doesn't come off just like some whiny guy, because that's always has been my thing. I never want to sound like the guy who, I don't want to be Grandpa Simpson, just old man yelling at the clouds and not doing anything. Like it sometimes it's hard in the podcasting sphere. Like it's easy to feel like just yelling into the void kind of thing. But that was my thing. I was like, it doesn't feel like I'm just some not even hot-headed, but just like some cool, like I'm going to pretend like I'm like having a hard time with my words today, let me tell you. Basically, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't coming off as just like some whiny person, basically. And she's no, like you call out the issues in the church broadly. I'm not speaking very specifically of this congregation, but just like as a system in the United States, you call out the church and show clearly out of scripture how it's failing and how as a congregation, we can be what the church is actually supposed to be. And I don't know if I could ever get a more impactful comment after a sermon than that. Like, to know that it is landing for one person that I got a lot of problems with you people, white evangelical American church, but the Bible does show what we're actually supposed to be like doing as the church if we actually just like read it and understood it the way that we're supposed to. The fact that that's actually landing with somebody and they were willing to say, hey, I hear what you're doing. And not only is it like making an impact, it's making this person feel fed. Like maybe this is showing that we're really more starved in the church than we really imagined. That to have any kind of like, love your neighbor and stop caring so much about numbers and clout and making decisions based off of what will look great on social media, and instead, love your neighbor and treat people with respect and, revolutionary ideas like that. That's what's making an impact on people. How starved are we really? Or as the kids would say, how cooked are we? Like seriously, how cooked is the American church? Yeah, that's just going to be the ongoing theme this year, isn't it? Brandon taking a moment to just talk about, wow, we really have messed up the church. Not me, not my fault. Ongoing issues from decades before I showed up. So, unfortunately, I have the pleasure of trying to be part of the solution, I guess. So how do you take feedback after a sermon? Well, I think for starters, you need to have your expectations set. That more than likely, it's just going to be a pleasantry. In my experience, if it's a negative comment, unless it is truly something that is worth fighting there in the moment, and even I will admit that at least in one occasion, I wish I did kind of stand my ground a bit more. You're going to have to take it on the chin because, again, the plethora of the complaints I've gotten from people are just people who didn't care for the way that I said something or how I preached the message. Just like stylistic differences, which is, that's subjective. Don't expect there to be some like, you are making such an impact on me every week. The sermon meant this to me this week. Don't expect those comments to happen with literally every single person every single week. Not a healthy expectation at all. No. But when they do come, it is perfectly fine to cherish those. Sometimes when I'm like in the doldrums of ministry, I've chronicled those here on My Seminary Life before. Those kinds of comments I rehearse in my mind, not to stroke my ego, but to just remind myself that yeah, this is where God wants me at right now. Like, this is where God wants there to be, this is where God wants me. This is the part of the field that I get to harvest in. And, those are the kinds of, like, when Israel is recounting the ways that God has been faithful in their history, like in the Psalms, you see those a lot. That's a way for me that I see God's faithfulness throughout my ministry, is when I go through hard patches and I remember certain people and how God used a message in the past to make an impact on them. Thanks for listening to today's episode. A little bit different. Hopefully that, if anything, sets your expectations better of like what will more than likely happen when somebody comes up to you after a sermon. Like, it's just going to be someone saying nice things to you. That's it. Thanks for showing up. Just like for this episode, thanks for listening to today's episode. If you haven't yet already, please rate and review this show wherever you get your podcasts. Pass this episode along to a friend. And I guess if you are going to rate and review the show, just say a pleasantry like, thanks for recording this episode. Just, that's it. Don't even like explain it further. Just write in your review. I think you can actually write reviews on, I think, Apple Podcasts. If you're on a platform, you can actually write a review. Just write, thanks for recording this episode, without even being specific as to what episode. Pass this episode along to a friend. And if you haven't yet already, make sure you check out the other great shows here on the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network, like Systematic Geekology, the Whole Church Podcast, and my sister show, Kung Fu Pizza Party, where I talk about all things martial arts media. I deliver high-flying action in 30 minutes or less, or at least that's the goal, and I serve up some wisdom one slice at a time. So check that show out as well, and check out my YouTube channel, Studio 219, a place for faith and pop culture. I teased a little bit what's coming up next week. Yeah, I'm going to talk about another sermon, not a rabbit trail, not an experiential preaching episode, but actually diving into the passage that I talked about, 2 little verses, and how it goes back to something I talked about all the way at the beginning of the show's existence. Yeah, we're going a little bit on spiritual formation with this episode coming up. But until then, this is Brandon signing off, reminding you as always that theology is for everyone, so keep on studying.